Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session on sovereign debt relief and debt restructuring system. And let me just start off by thanking our co-hosts for this event, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, FES, and the Consensus Building Institute for their help, not only in organizing this session, but really for convening the roundtable of experts that has produced the report that we're going to discuss today. And as you'll see from the report, it represents the outcome of a discussion amongst a diverse group representing different perspectives, which as we were discussing just before we went live, is essential to try and find a degree of consensus on this topic. And the report itself, and I do encourage you to look at it when you have access to it, is quite wide-ranging in its recommendations on debt transparency, on better contract standards, on the comparable treatment of creditors, and also on the roles of the IFIs in this process. The way we have structured the discussion today, we're going to have one of the roundtable members, Yanis Manueltis, who's on screen with us now, to briefly present the report. Then we will have a panel of distinguished experts offer their views and reactions, moderated by another roundtable member, Nancy Lee, who's of course also a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. And we will make sure to preserve some time for questions from the audience as part of this process. Now, let me just say that, amongst all the other things that we've learned over the past 2 years during this pandemic and the reaction, the economic and financial impact of it, the international reactions to it, is that it has been a revealing test of the sovereign debt architecture. The G20, as most of you know, advanced some temporary relief for mostly poor countries on the debt that was coming due during 2020 and parts of 2021. This achieved some positive results, but on a limited scale. But the process also surfaced quite fundamental differences amongst creditors and between creditors and debtors about what debt should be disclosed and how, which creditors should be subject to comparable treatment disciplines, what actually comparable treatment means, and when these debt reduction as distinct from debt rescheduling is necessary. These issues aren't going to go away. Many low-income countries, middle-income countries are already under debt distress, and more will likely come under pressure next year as capital flows adjust to changing global monetary conditions. So we think that CGD and FES and CBI can play a useful role here. First, by giving you a plethora of acronyms, but also by providing a platform for the frank discussions among stakeholders, as well as spotlighting and offering practical ideas for change where that is needed for better outcomes. So before turning to Yanis, what I'd like to do is turn to Michael Brunning, who is the executive director of FES in New York, for his thoughts. Michael is in a meeting at the moment, so he is going to come to us via pre-recorded message. And then we're going to turn to David Fairman, managing director of the CBI, the Consensus Building Institute. And I should say that consistent with the name of the organization with which he's affiliated, David was instrumental in helping the roundtable participants come together around a comprehensive set of recommendations, building consensus on this very difficult set of questions. So with that, let me now ask our colleagues to put up the video from Michael Browning.
A very good morning from me, and it's my pleasure to join Masood Ahmed and David Fairman to welcome you to today's Roundtable Report launch, responding to the risks of COVID debt distress. Our event today is organized jointly by the Center for Global Development, the Consensus Building Institute, and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. And I realize that opening a virtual format with a pre-recorded virtual statement isn't exactly ideal. And I hope you bear with me despite it sort of combining the worst of two worlds. I very much regret that I cannot speak to you live and in person today, since when you are listening to this and when you are watching this, I will be stuck in Berlin's infamous and I would say almost completely finished airport. I wanted to take these brief opening remarks as an opportunity to first and foremost express my gratitude to, of course, my colleagues and to our partners who have really worked tirelessly for the last half year, 6 months to make this event possible, but also, of course, to thank them for their previous work on the report that we are launching today, which I believe is both timely and extremely important. The report we are launching today represents the results of quite an unusual and intensive process in which a geographically diverse set of very influential experts were brought together. The group, of course, included academics, it included former senior government officials, but it also included private attorneys who have represented sovereign debtors, bilateral and multilateral creditors in the past. So it was a fascinating group, and I would like to thank David Fairman in particular of CBI for facilitating the group meetings. Now, looking at the report, I can only stress how pleased we are with the results and of course with the political recommendations that I believe are really compelling. Promoting transparent, full, fair, and effective private creditor participation in responding to debt distress is absolutely crucial. And a discussion of how this can be achieved is timely with regards to the annual meetings of IMF and of the World Bank, of course, starting on October 11th, but also with regards to the G20 summit, which, as you all know, will be held in Italy at the end of the month. And as you are well aware, of course, the report represents a consensus. It represents a consensus of the group, but obviously we are only too aware of the fact that a true global consensus on how to move forward globally on this question is still not exactly a given. So I very much hope and I'm confident that today's meeting can contribute to an emerging consensus on these questions. And I would like to end my opening statement by just wishing you all the best for a fruitful and hopefully constructive discussion. And once again, I only regret that I cannot be there in person with you today. Thank you very much.
That was the statement from Michael. Thank you. Very nice statement. And we wish him all the best while he navigates his way through the impressive and almost complete airport in Berlin. And let me turn now to David.
Thanks so much, Masood, and to you and to Nancy Lee and to your colleagues at the Center for Global Development for hosting us today, and Nancy also for her great participation in this process. Thanks also so much to Michael, and I want to call out especially for thanks here, Sarah Burke from FES New York, my partner in launching this venture and very central to thinking through how to bring together such a remarkable group of international experts with diverse professional experience. I want to underscore briefly the points that both Masood and Michael made about the diversity of this group, because I think it's important to understand that diversity to understand why this report might matter. It does represent, as the group represented, the perspectives of those who have represented in the trenches of debt restructuring, both sovereign debtors and their private and public creditors. And it represents the multilateralism and the role of the IFIs that all of the group thinks is central and critical to constructive ways to address debt restructuring going forward. One more word about the process. This is not a consensus that was developed by people being nice to each other. This was a consensus developed through some very hard, constructive back and forth where people offered ideas and their colleagues firmly, though politely, challenged them on both the desirability and the feasibility of the things that were being offered. These recommendations are, if anything, battle tested through this dialogue. So in this panel discussion, I think we have a great opportunity for the panelists who were not part of the dialogue itself to further test what is offered, and I very much look forward to that. I just want to stress that the process that we went through to arrive at this report is one that I think all the participants in the roundtable gave their best to. They gave their best to each other, and there was a great deal of constructive exchange. With that, I want to turn to introduce Yannis Manolidis, one of the members of the roundtable, who has graciously agreed to present in summary the main points of the report. Yannis is a partner at the London-based law firm Allen & Overy. He has 30 and more years experience in all manner of transactional law, and in particular, and highly relevant for this conversation, has been a very, very central participant in several major debt restructurings, including leading the steering committee of private creditors for Greece in that restructuring. He is not only a practicing attorney, but a writer and author and thinker whose perspectives on these issues have influenced not just others in the legal world, but also sovereigns and multilaterals considering these issues. I will also just say of Yannis, he brings to this work a wonderful sense of humor, I think developed over many long nights at tables negotiating difficult issues where it was either going to be laughing or crying. And he helped us a lot in our process by bringing a light touch to some challenging conversations. So Yannis, thank you again for agreeing to present, and may I ask you to go ahead. Thanks.
Well, thank you, David. And I don't know what to say about all this, especially sort of influence anybody except some of my colleagues who sometimes don't have a choice but to agree. But thank you very much. And thank you for asking me to present briefly the report. I think I do recommend the report. The report is in its own way very concise, and trying to summarize it was already sort of a bit of a challenge. And I don't think I did any much really greater job in this presentation that I'm going to share with you very shortly than just put what David very expertly sort of put himself, summarized it in bold in the report itself. It is a great report, and indeed it has all these features that were mentioned. It was a lively participation, sometimes very sort of great views exchanged. So what I will do is we have limited time. I will start with a summary of the report, and we can move in the discussion. I can come back as required. So. The background to all of this is known. I'm not going to stand the numbers. You will, I think, receive, or I think the slides will be made available afterwards. I think I've agreed to that. It's nothing really particularly kind of unknown here. The numbers are very compelling. What I have here in this first slide is actually two sets of numbers, the ones we have in the report and the first bit, and then the ones below, which are thanks to again the colleagues at the Brookings Institution, sort of our updated numbers about what is going to be debt service and external stock, what was external stock in 2019, debt service in the years to come for all developing countries, and then the DSSI group of countries. And we're talking about staggering numbers. So that's really the background to this. The roundtable, you've heard about how it was convened, and at the time it was convened, we were all afraid or were expecting sort of immediate series of crises. that did not happen, and it's very clear that we as we were discussing, we had to sort of consider why it did not happen. Why is it that some people some countries continue to maintain or regain market access, or even themselves engage in unconventional monetary policies? But it was also clear to us that this was possibly just a crisis postponed. The numbers are just too overwhelming, and the needs of the countries and indeed the world are just huge. So as we started, we thought, and it was again a consensus thing, it sort of emerged naturally from our discussions, that the scope should also consider sort of longer term aspects of the crisis and what would sort of be required. So so this is again, when you read the report and when you see the points today, you have to remember, some of the comments are made with the benefit of hindsight. It's 10 months after the roundtable was convened, and we're talking about a continuously evolving reality. But when we started sort of considering where we are and what recommendations we could put, we thought, well, where are we today? And I think the consensus was, well, it's not as dire as it's sometimes made out to be. We have several processes, certainly in the official sector, what was Paris Club, now possibly Common Framework. I appreciate it's still vague, etc., but still we have something. And the private creditors themselves had over time developed accepted processes, and everybody seems more or less to agree that in time where you have great distress, the IMF programs with the debt sustainability analysis and envelopes really sort of provide a path to resolution. So we considered what were the old what were the new challenges, which is the proliferation of creditors, the types of creditors and instruments they use, and the fact that a lot of public debt really appears sort of or comes in indirectly or contingently, and what is important to resolve all that is to have great capacity in the sovereign debtor. I mean, unfortunately, in many of the situations this is lacking, and to have on the other side private creditors, generally creditors who have direct and long-term interest in the outcomes. And the ability of creditors to organize themselves, I think, was also recognized as something which was very important. So I'll go through the recommendations in outline. So there were two, as I said, broadly. I'll skip this slide, except to say that it was one set of recommendations for transparent, full, fair, and effective private credit participation. But as you will see, not just private creditor, but just generally all creditors. And then as supporting investment in sustainable development, while the risks of distress are managed or addressed. So short term, we thought that we have to increase the transparency. You really cannot have a restructuring or really an understanding of what the problem is if you don't know what you have there. You don't have the data, and you have really all the debt and its various contours. So and we thought on that it would be useful not just to do it at the points of extreme stress, but also to basically even have the IMF come in with sort of what other countries to be able to ask the IMF for updated their sustainability analysis, so that we could have almost, if you want, a constant sort of monitoring. Otherwise, there was a number of important recommendations on transparency and on disclosure of information. And that is not just on the countries themselves, that they really ought to come out and tell us what their public debt is, but the G20 should lead themselves on, should take a lead with the publication of their own contracts. And obviously technical assistance should be offered, and various sort of high tech or new tech or technologies and platforms should be promoted. And even that if nothing else almost works, that creditor countries, but in a way it has to be done in a joint way, should consider even limiting enforceability of non-disclosed contracts. So the other thing was, what do we do to increase incentives for participating in reprofiling or restructuring? And again, this is it's nothing, I think, just generally new, that we expect that everybody should come in to participate in good faith discussions, but the important thing is to have intercreditor equity, which is sometimes called sort of comparable treatment. Again, we didn't go into details to explain what it is. We recognize that comparable treatment may hide lots of complex differences. But if the principle of intercreditor equity and comparable treatment are adhered to, then then we have a very good starting point. Now, the other thing that we decided to sort of focus on is that there are all sorts of additional things, and this is perhaps appears to you as something which is not quite the sort of a hodgepodge, but it's really lots of different ideas. I think they have all something in common. I'll mention in the end. But if we want financial, sort of regulated financial institutions to participate, maybe as during COVID we made financial sort of space, sort of regulatory space for these people to give relief domestically. Maybe we should be doing the same thing internationally. Maybe we should consider be more smart about the enhancements that MDBs and official agencies offer to facilitate credit. We did it in the past very successful in the Latin American crisis, and maybe we should be thinking about this again. We focus very much on long-term sustainability, and we thought that, and I'd like to see what Elena says about that, that credit rating agencies should consider ways to reflect accurately the post-restructuring outlook for sovereign debtors. They now sort of give, obviously negative ratings during the time of restructuring, but what is important for everybody is to see how things are going to go forward, and that can really sort of help the markets and the countries. And indeed, we thought that it is important for jurisdictions whose laws are used mostly for the sovereign contracts for external debt, that would be mostly England and New York, to see ways, find ways that can limit abuse of the system. Again, we didn't go into specifics, but we thought that is something sort of worth a discussion, worth commencing, as indeed to consider again why it was that we even started having the discussion on SDRM back then, what we learned, whether it's possible or feasible, and I know some people think it is, some others have doubts, but indeed the debate, I think itself would be very beneficial. And to do that almost on a continuous basis through some sort of platform like the one we mentioned about Commission of the Great and the Good. Now, I'd like to say that the other bit, this is the last slide that I have on the substance of the report. We were all very keen on thinking of the day after, because we all know that the whole world, in particular the less low-income and middle-income countries, need an awful lot of money to develop, and to develop in the right way. So we wanted to make a point, and these are the in summary the points we made, that we want to make sure that the multilaterals will be able to provide funding to countries to maintain, to promote sustainable development. In a way, sorry, I want to add that these recommendations are meant to fit in with what may happen during the restructuring. So when we do the restructuring, we have to have a view or look at these points. The IMF program and to setting the macroeconomic parameters for return to debt sustainability is something that should continue to happen. It shouldn't be something that happens just in a crisis. A lot of creditors, even if the ones who disagree with the analysis of the IMF, at least have as sort of a single point of reference, and they can themselves develop their strategies and contributions and decide how to behave in a cooperative way. Mobilizing platforms for sustainable investments has been mentioned by many already in other fora. We certainly believe that that's extremely important. We also think it's extremely important for sovereign debtors to consider state contingent bonds. That's certainly particular hobby also of mine with GDP-linked bonds, but we believe that gives greater flexibility for everybody. And of course, the countries themselves have to keep on building their capacity. So, and I think last but not least, that there are other things that help in overall stability, and developing domestic capital markets and long-term bond and insurance markets domestically really will help the stability a lot. So if I were to move on, so that's my last slide, but if I were to sort of summarize where we were, I'd say that we want to ensure that there will be an all creditor participation, private and official, of course, with the exception of MDBs who enjoy preferred creditor status. There has to be overall a legitimacy of process. I mean, that was very clear in everything we said, and with transparency of debt and clarity in the debt sustainability analysis, so everybody can position themselves around that. There has to be intercreditor equity or comparable treatment, and where we restructure, we have to have in mind the future financing needs of the country and the long-term collective and individual country needs for sustainability. Now, I want to say one last thing, because that to me is very important in this kind of a discovery, that looking at all the recommendations, I felt that it was the first time that in a forum of this sort, we went beyond the debate of statute or contract reform. It was really thinking through what tools do countries, creditors, and their Bretton Woods institutions and the policymakers need to make the process work better. And there is a little bit of this and of the other. I called it earlier. I said earlier it may appear to you as a hodgepodge, but I think really you need to see it as people sitting together and striving to make the best of a sort of a loss allocation system, which is basically what insolvency systems do the world around. So I urge you to read the report. The slides will be available. So I will now pass on to Nancy, and thank you very much for this.
Thanks so much, Giannis, for that really excellent summary of a very comprehensive report. As you heard, it was not easy to do all of that in 15 minutes. As we just heard, Giannis covered the issues of debt transparency, so critical to discipline and where we have a long distance to go. Debt contract standards and enforcement, which as Giannis pointed out is an issue both on the debt authorization side for debtor countries as well as for issuing jurisdictions. Comparable treatment of creditors, which is really essential for establishing the basis for collective action, and where we also have a long way to go. And then the roles of the international financial institutions, which, as Giannis described, really permeate this whole set of challenges, from the transparency issue and where those a definitive database sits, to the question of technical assistance to debtor countries when they're undertaking and authorizing debt, to debt sustainability analysis, to the whole question of the role of their finance in the debt restructuring process, and particularly the use of credit enhancements when the public interest is served in debt exchanges. So a lot to discuss, and I want to get to the panelists. I wanted to mention that this report is now available in Chinese on the FES website, which is, I really think, a fortunate availability since China is such an important actor in all of these discussions. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that I encourage the audience to submit their comments and questions, which we will get to at the end, either by emailing to events@cgdev.org or tweeting @cgdev #CGD Talks or via YouTube. So let's go to the panelists now, but first let me introduce them briefly. We have 5 panelists: Andrew Ali, who is CEO of Southbridge, which is a Pan-African investment bank, and a former president of the African Finance Corporation, the Development Bank of Nigeria. We have Elena Dugar, who's chair of Moody's Macroeconomic Board and manages the research team in the Credit Strategy and Research Group. Obviously, rating agencies also a key player. We have Anna Gelpern, who is the Anne Fleming Research Professor at Georgetown Law, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm proud to say, a highly esteemed former colleague of mine at the US Treasury Department. We have Eric Lecomte, who is Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network, a developing coalition of more than 750 religious organizations, and also a member of expert working groups at UNCTAD and the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. And we have Greer Meisel's, who is the Chief of Staff of the Institute of International Finance, and also a former Treasury official, including senior advisor to the Undersecretary for International Affairs. So as you can see, this is a group which is really going to look at this set of issues from a variety of different perspectives and their critical perspectives. So I wanted to start with Anna, because Anna has written on all of these issues. And we know these issues are quite complicated and longstanding, and is extremely well placed to sort this out for us. We know some sequencing of efforts will be essential, and the report tries to distinguish, as Jana described, between short-term issues and longer-term issues. So I want to pose 2 questions to you. First of all, just setting aside what's possible, what changes in your mind would have the greatest impact at this stage? And then, as a separate question, what changes are most feasible? What are the ones where, if you were, for example, back in government, where would you start in trying to move the system to a better place? Anna.
Well, Nancy, first of all, thank you so much. And everyone, you have to realize Nancy was my boss, and an unbelievably awesome, in every sense, with the emphasis on awe, boss when I was in the government. So this is a special delight, and it's wonderful to be with so many old friends. And really, congratulations to the 3 institutions and everyone in this roundtable. This is a timely and unbelievably efficient report. And again, this totally reminds me of Nancy. I mean, there's an enormous density of substance and seriousness in a very pithy text. So just, read it several times, that you'll discover something new each time. So, look, I think the stage that I think Masoud and Yanis in particular set is really important. We've been teetering on the verge of something for almost 2 years, and that something is not good. And the architecture for handling whatever that something might be is really in flux. So when you ask what would have the greatest impact in this really, really rich report, look, I mean, part of me wants to say, well, gee, complete contracts and a really excellent bankruptcy regime would be awfully nice. But that's where I don't think you mean for me to be that, impractical, right? So then I think with the report, you've got to get into the nitty gritty and sort of ask what is the kind of meta problem at the moment. And I do think it's still the diversity and dynamism of, actors, instruments in this ecosystem, which translates into, unfortunately, lack of trust and serious information and coordination problems. And again, unfortunately, we just have not been taking the coordination challenge seriously. So what we've got is, in some ways, an agreement to disagree on fundamental concepts. And I think Yanis really highlighted this. What is comparability? Comparability is in the eye of the beholder, right? And what I love about your report, in a way, is the fact that you're calling for public commitment on the part of the stakeholders to a threshold level of equity, to a course of action. And what I think this means, and I may be putting words in your guys' mouths, but what I think it means is not really, well, we all commit to comparability, problem solved, but to a serious and public discussion of what that means, right? So to me, getting away from a world where the debtor is really the only point of leverage for anybody in the system, right? And the debtor in distress is least capable of pulling, anybody along and forcing them to act. They don't have the bandwidth to, have breakfast. And really having the other stakeholders on the record committing to seriously hashing out sustainability, comparability, equity would be massively valuable. Failing that, my second choice, I know you didn't give me that option, but hey, would be contingent debt. This is the complete contract story. I think the official sector should be lending all contingent, and that's the only place where I'm very happy with, subsidies and incentives and enhancements, because that would give the debtor the breathing room to do what they need to do. Now, if I were at the Treasury right now, first of all, I'd probably get kicked out. But second, for just, talking smack and having my head in the clouds. But debt transparency, I know it sounds anodyne, motherhood and apple pie, but you've got to realize the pathetic state of disclosure. Like, we don't know what debt is. Did you know that there is a country in the common framework that owes half of its debt to a certain somebody that doesn't even call it debt, and it's all collateralized, right? So, I mean, the fact that we are in this sad state has got to mean that every official creditor, and you get bonus points if you're the first mover, has got to publish their general terms and conditions. We don't need to know about your submarines, but we do need to know what your standard form is at a minimum. Japan International Cooperation Agency does this. Nobody died. And then the debtors should be publishing their contracts. Again, the Philippines, Sierra Leone are doing this. Cameroon did this for a while. Nobody died. I think this would really put pressure on the system to have the kind of long-term discussion that I'd love to see. So again, thank you, congratulations, and public debt is public. Publish your stuff, and then let's talk.
Thanks, Anna. That was an excellent way to launch the conversation. Pathetic state of disclosure. Nobody died when certain actors actually did disclose. Very helpful points. And then the question of comparable treatment and how it is in fact defined. So we're going to come back to all of this, but let's turn now to Eric from a very different, who sits sort of in a different place. You have been a strong advocate for debt relief, and more generally for mobilizing more resources for poor countries, particularly with all of the issues that have arisen during the pandemic. We're seeing problems and delays in the global vaccination efforts. So we know things are going to be difficult for a long time. We know that even when there is a global recovery, or as there is a global recovery, it will be uneven, unequal, and uncertain. So how do you make the case to Americans and to citizens from other wealthier countries that sovereign debt relief and a better architecture for debt relief are urgent priorities? Eric.
Nancy, thank you. And it's so good to be with all of you here today. I think these questions are incredibly critical, and the report is very fine. I believe that even if only a fraction of some of the particular recommendations in the report were already in place, we would be dealing with a crisis less serious than we already are dealing with. Let me say and start off that largely, I believe the IMF has answered some of this question for us this morning. Just a few minutes ago, the World Economic Outlook report was released. And I think one of the most striking pieces in this just released report is that the downgrades for the global economy that the International Monetary Fund are looking at are both for advanced wealthy economies as well as poor countries. So this is something we've been talking about really since the dawn of the pandemic, that because of the debt crisis, because of the financial crisis, because of the reality that most countries in the world are either in a debt crisis, facing a debt crisis, or facing unsustainable debt, ultimately, those countries are not able to respond to the pandemic, and wealthy countries and advanced economies are now facing supply shortages. It's in part why we're dealing with such a high degree of inflation and growing inflation in the US and other wealthy economies. So I think the lack of having these tools in place to be able to deal with the debt crisis, to be able to deal with global health crises, means that Americans and citizens in other wealthy countries will continue to see rising inflation, will continue to see supply shortages, and these economic shocks are going to continue to grow over time. Now, this coupled with the lack of vaccines and the lack of ability for countries to mobilize vaccines even raises more concerns. And that's also what we're hearing from the International Monetary Fund this morning in their flagship report. And part of the reason that developing countries are having a challenge accessing vaccines, but perhaps even more importantly, that they're dealing with fragile healthcare systems, is because 40% of developing countries were facing a debt crisis before the pandemic began. So we see how important the Roundtable's work is in terms of looking at these particular recommendations. Debt transparency is a very significant part of the solution. And having a high degree of public budget transparency, of debt transparency, means that we have preventative measures down the line. Also, because countries, because of debt, they are often still paying more on debt than they are on healthcare and social infrastructure combined. So these particular issues are ones that Americans and citizens in wealthy countries really need to be paying attention to, because of the lack of infrastructure we have on dealing with debt and financial crisis, the lack of global infrastructure on healthcare. What it means right now is that Americans and citizens in Europe and other wealthy countries are poised to see further economic shocks over the next 5 years. So again, this is why the report is so significant. When we look broadly at the numbers just released by the World Bank, 250 million jobs lost around the world, mostly in middle developing economies. Again, that's why we're facing supply shortages and economic shocks. These countries are facing severe debt and financial crisis. According to the United Nations, 265 million people are facing famine for the first time. So also for Americans and wealthy countries, because we didn't have the infrastructure in place in the first, initially, it means that taxpayers in these countries are going to pay more in the long run to deal with these incredible crises that must be dealt with or we're going to have continual economic shocks come to haunt us in the North?
Thank you, Eric. That's a great sort of crystallization of the magnitude and depth of the problem. In terms of jobs, food security, as well as the effect that the problem is already having, the debt is already having on debtor countries' fiscal situations and the strains that are occurring. As you mentioned, in some cases, larger expenditures on debt service than on health and education. So this is not a marginal problem. This is a fundamental problem, as you point out. So I wanted to turn to Greer now at IIAF, because IIAF has really played a critical role in building consensus among private creditors on the case for collective action. It's facilitated development of a voluntary code of conduct between sovereign debtors and private creditors, as well as voluntary principles for debt transparency. But as the report points out, and as we just heard from Anna, we have a long way to go on comparable treatment and debt transparency. The private sector did not participate in the DSSI, and only 3 countries at the moment are restructuring under the G20 comparable framework. So give us your assessment of the situation. And in particular, what do we need to change? What would make restructuring more efficient and timely? Because these long restructuring processes are costly, both on the debtor side and on the creditor side. What are your members saying? What are their solutions for the problem? And then give us a sense of your members' perspective on the magnitude of the problem and what they're concerned about going forward in terms of sovereign debt developments.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you to CGD. Thank you to Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation for inviting me to join this really important discussion. And again, echoing what those who came before me, congratulations on the launch of this paper. I really do think that the authors have done a remarkable job on setting out the key issues we're all thinking about, especially in the context of debt sustainability challenges, the impact of the pandemic, and proposed reforms to the international sovereign debt architecture. I'll try to keep this brief. I'll focus on kind of 3 main areas. First, just a quick overview of some of our work with private creditors. And this will kind of provide some context on the lack of private sector participation that you referenced, Nancy. Next, kind of give you a brief perspective on the solutions. I'll give you an overview of our work on updating the principles for stable capital flows and fair debt restructuring. And then maybe if there's time, just kind of a general sense of how our members are thinking about the debt dynamics that they're seeing. So I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail about kind of our work with the G20. The IIF was told to kind of marshal private sector members to participate in the DSSI. We reached out to over 100 different private sector lenders and creditors who represented approximately $45 trillion of assets under management to think about what we might be able to do in support of the DSSI. We found that there was really tremendous appetite with our members to help these vulnerable countries, and that maybe more importantly, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So, you know, as you just noted, Nancy, and has been widely reported, their private creditor participation in the DSSI was limited. But I do think it's important to maybe mention some of the reasons why. I think that those are a little bit less known. You know, first, the countries in question really had limited commercial debt. Of the 73 eligible countries for the DSSI, only 22 had outstanding Eurobonds, and less than half had any private sector commercial debt at all. So the scope of private sector participation was always a bit limited from the outset, and I don't think that that's widely known. Second, you know, the DSSI raised concerns about inadvertently triggering an event of default. I won't get too much into that because I'm sure future panelists will mention that. Third, and this is what's also very important to our members at the IIF, both borrowing countries and private creditors were really concerned that a request for forbearance would make future market access more expensive and perhaps even prohibitive. And without the ability to borrow in private markets, a liquidity crisis could really easily become a solvency crisis. And I just highlight here the importance of keeping market access or acquiring it in the context of reaching sustainable development goals. As we know, very substantial private sector funding will be needed to reach the SDGs. And again, happy to talk about that a little bit more later. Fourth was a technical point that was somewhat limiting in terms of private sector participation around net present value neutrality. I won't go into that in great detail, but that was really an issue when we were thinking of how the private sector could participate. And then, some issues around credit rating downgrades. And I know Elena is probably coming shortly after me, so I won't go into that. And then, comparable treatment for private creditors, whether in the DSSI, whether in the common framework, or really with any debt restructuring, really does require much better debt transparency than is currently available. I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir in the report about the importance of debt transparency. Obviously, Anna was talking about the pathetic state of disclosure. Eric also mentioned the importance of this, and that's really one of the areas that the IIF has been really focused on. Improving debt transparency will, in our minds, enhance international sovereign debt architecture. And we've made a lot of progress with the implementation of the voluntary principles for debt transparency on the private sector side, working with the OECD as the host for the initiative. And again, happy to go into that in a little bit more detail. One other thing I would note in terms of the private sector and kind of how they've been able to help going forward, obviously private negotiations, consent solicitations, but I would also just note the new financing. Since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, DSSI eligible countries have raised over $22 billion in international bond markets. In contrast, the temporary relief that was provided by the DSSI over this period accounts for around $5 billion, according to the World Bank. And in addition, this period has seen a lot of cross-border commercial banking flows to DSSI eligible countries, around $10 billion or so. So, I know that there's often a move to say that, the private sector didn't participate in DSSI, but they have made very substantial contributions to liquidity needs of DSSI eligible countries over the past 18 months. I'll touch briefly on the principles for stable capital and fair debt restructuring, because you've asked about, some of the solutions to make sovereign debt restructuring more efficient and effective. So the principles, which I'll just kind of shorthand as the principles, really kind of show the need to avoid a top-down statutory solution. The principles are also one of those unique sorts of situations where there's really good collective public-private sector effort. They are under the leadership of our group of trustees. The group of trustees are headed by Governor Francois de Villeroy of the Banque de France, of Igong from the PBOC, and then on the private sector side, Axel Weber, who's the chairman of UBS. So, this is one of those instances where you are seeing some of that cooperation between the two sides. And right now, we're currently conducting a comprehensive update of the principles. Our thanks especially to Giannis, who's one of the key collaborators and contributors. There's a whole slew of things that we're looking to update. Again, if we have time for another round, I'm happy to go into some of those. And then I guess, you asked Nancy more broadly, are our members sort of concerned about worsening debt dynamics, and especially as interest rates in advanced countries rise? The short answer is very simple. The answer is yes. Our members are always concerned about debt and rising debt levels, and now is no different. For example, by the IIF's calculations, global debt soared to a new record in the second quarter of this year, reaching $296 trillion. Global debt is now more than 36 trillion above the pre-pandemic level. So these figures are staggering. They're breathtaking. It's not good. However, I don't think, you can necessarily call this on the bright side, but now for lack of a better shorthand on bright side, the global debt to GDP ratio has declined for the first time since the onset of the pandemic. Overall, 85% of the countries in our sample recorded a decline in debt ratios. And obviously this was driven to a certain extent by the strong rebound in economic activity. But, of course, it's true that the recovery has not been strong enough to bring debt ratios below the pre-pandemic levels in most cases. So, again, there's a lot of different things that I could touch on, but I am just going to briefly mention the debt transparency issue. Debt statistics remain largely incomplete for many developing countries. In many cases, the figures are not comparable across countries because of definitional differences. And it's clear that a lack of transparency increases uncertainty, risk, and borrowing costs. So, I think debt transparency is also not just about data. It's incredibly important, but it also requires that active communication and coordination between investors and borrowers. If there's time later on, again, I'll go into more about where the voluntary principles are. But, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join the session today. I do think it's important, to kind of give the private sector perspective. But, if I had to sum up everything I just said in 2 points, we need better debt transparency. Our members are concerned about debt. And, we stand ready to obviously work to try to address some of these issues. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Guia. That's a great tour of the landscape. And we definitely will come back to this transparency question and who or what institutions really should be the key actors in transparency. But I was also struck by your point about private sector participation and the fact that there was, as I think you put it, 22 billion in new issuances, if I understood you correctly, last year, and you compare that to the 5 billion in the DSSI debt relief. And that's a really important point, although the question is whether the countries that had the new access also, that you're comparing whether it's the same group of countries that had new access versus received the debt relief, but we can come back to that. That's really helpful. So Elena, so you're at an institution that's a key actor, a rating agency. And as I think Greer just pointed out, debtor country participation in the DSSI depended heavily on how they perceive the likely consequences for their sovereign ratings. So I wanted to ask you if, first of all, do you see any difference between a G20-led effort to support temporary relief versus a unilateral decision by a debtor country to suspend payments? Because it seems like those are really quite different. And then I wanted to ask you in particular on the report's recommendation, first of all, to reflect accurately the post-restructuring outlook for sovereign debtors, referring both to the duration of adverse rating changes during debt distress developments and to the positive impact of restructuring on debt profiles. So do you agree with the report's recommendation in those ways? And what is your view on how the rating agency should address this challenge of signaling to the markets when a restructuring is happening or will happen? What should the signaling be in terms of whether this strengthens the situation over time or should raise investors' concerns?
Thank you. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the opportunity to share our perspectives. We welcome the increased dialogue between the official sector and the private sector on sovereign debt challenges. We welcome the focus of the report on transparency, on increasing transparency, the forward-looking nature of the report, in terms of focusing on sustainable development after debt distress, and also recognizing the debt challenges facing some middle income countries, many of which are driven by physical climate change, which we have been flagging as well. I'm happy to walk through our approach to managing ratings through the pandemic and how we manage ratings around sovereign debt restructuring. And I'll split the two a little bit since they're slightly different angles. But I should start by noting that we do not give policy advice and we do not participate in debt restructurings. Rating agencies are an observer in that process. So my remarks today are based on our approach to rating management and on the evidence from the historical data. To start, let me just point out that ratings were not the driving factor for the vast majority of DSSI eligible countries. So over half of DSSI eligible countries are not rated at all. The ratings for another share already incorporated a high probability of default and loss. So there were a variety of factors affecting countries' DSSI decisions, including the fact that the potential benefits of the DSSI were uneven across countries, and they were very small for many countries. And also, just for context, the DSSI debt relief was relatively small compared to the COVID shock in fiscal terms. By World Bank estimates, on average, the potential debt relief in 2020 was 0.6% of GDP. And that's against an expansion of external financing needs of 5% of GDP. So our approach through the pandemic, our rating approach through the pandemic has been very measured and focused on the most exposed issuers. The COVID shock, the health crisis, the deep economic contraction, the uneven access to liquidity, and the lower commodity prices all created a severe credit shock across many sectors and issuers in 2020. And in such an environment of broad decline in credit quality, Moody's made rating adjustments to ensure that the rating system continues to reflect our views on the ordinal ranking of credit risk. So while many debt issuers experienced some negative trends during the pandemic, rating actions were taken only on those sectors and issuers where these trends led to a material change in the credit profile. For example, the pandemic led to a sharp increase in debt levels among all sovereign issuers. But one-off increases in debt burdens do not typically trigger sovereign rating changes. Credit analysis focuses on lasting changes to sovereign credit profiles arising from a shock. And in most countries, the rating implications of the pandemic will depend on the economic recovery and on the ability of countries to stabilize their debt trajectories over time and ahead of future shocks. Rating quality remains strong through the pandemic. So in general, Moody's sovereign ratings have a solid history of performance over the last 40 years. They are highly predictive of default risk when benchmarked against actual default experience. And that has carried through the pandemic as well. And one last point on this is the ratings have also been less volatile than market measures of sovereign credit risk. Ratings have emphasized differentiation in creditworthiness among countries. And in this respect, they serve as a moderating force through periods of tightening market liquidity, including through the pandemic as well. So let me now touch upon how we manage ratings within the context of debt restructurings, and I'll answer your questions more directly as well. So ratings reflect debt repayment capacity. In the event of a debt restructuring, ratings will reflect an expectation of default if investors are likely to suffer losses. But upon the conclusion of the debt restructuring, subsequent ratings will reflect the benefits of debt relief. So in practical terms, the ratings of the old securities will reflect an expectation of loss ahead of a debt restructuring. At the conclusion of the debt exchange, the old securities are withdrawn as are their ratings, and the new securities are newly rated based on their creditworthiness, looking forward over the medium term, typically 3 to 5 years out. So one thing to note, looking at the historical data, the average rating moves up slowly after debt restructuring. But it's not because the rating doesn't reflect the benefits of debt relief. It's because the average debt restructuring does not fully resolve the fundamental credit weaknesses that led to the credit stress in the first place. If we look at the data shows, and this is something that the report acknowledges as well, the average debt restructuring provides liquidity relief, but not solvency relief. If you look at the average country emerges from a debt restructuring with debt to GDP ratios 5 percentage points higher than before the debt restructuring. And that's not the least because 90% of debt restructurings are accompanied by recessions, almost 60% by banking and currency crisis. The average period of market exclusion after debt restructuring is about 5 years. And overall, the probability of redefault for sovereigns is about 40%, 40. So debt restructurings are typically very disruptive events and recovery takes time. And the problem is not that ratings do not reflect the benefits of debt restructuring, but that many debt exchanges are not enough to materially improve creditworthiness. And I think that echoes some of the remarks that Eric and Anna made earlier and some of the remarks that are in the report. You're asking if there's a difference between a G20-led suspension of debt payments versus unilateral debt suspension by the country. From a credit perspective, it would matter if it implies a different likelihood of redefault in the future. And from that perspective, the fact that this is a pandemic shock and not the result of policy making is very important as well. So I'm sure I'm over time, but given the report has a number of recommendations around the post-restructuring outlook for countries, I'll conclude by saying that we are interested in understanding more about what the perceived need for more information is, and we are willing to consider publishing further research or elaborating on any of these aspects if it's helpful to the market. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena. That was also very helpful. And your numbers about how long market exclusion occurs and the probability of redefault, are really significant, it seems to me, and they really may point to back to debt sustainability analyses and whether they are sufficiently accurate or realistic in terms of guiding the depth and breadth of the debt restructuring process, which is another thing we can come back to. That points back to the IMF. But I wanted to turn to Andrew because your perspective is obviously absolutely central to this whole set of issues, because how private investors see them is key to assessing prospects for investment after debt or after debt restructuring. So I have two questions. First, how do investors in Africa think about sovereign debt sustainability now? Are you seeing this as a major factor affecting their investment decisions going forward? Is this really something on their minds in terms of determining their investment strategies? Is it sort of a regional factor, or is it limited to a set of the worst affected countries? And second, similar to my question for Greer, are your clients generally worried about worsening debt dynamics as global monetary conditions change, and we can anticipate perhaps some turmoil in global capital flows as interest rates in advanced countries rise?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And also congratulations to everyone on the report. I mean, I think it was very good. Like most people, I kind of can support wholeheartedly many of the conclusions. I think the one around transparency is perhaps the most important, and I think most people have said that, because again, from my perspective, I think one of the things that really is the focus of many investor or potential investors' minds is really, what is the actual situation in the country? And, I was in a particular country, I won't mention which one. At the time, the finance minister announced and it was in the media, that various sort of government agencies should come and let the finance ministry know, how much debt they'd taken sort of bilaterally with different providers, because the finance ministry didn't have a track on that. So, debt transparency can be quite fundamental when your own finance ministry doesn't even really know what government, quote unquote, debt obligations might be. Having said that, to directly answer the question about investor perceptions, the headline answer is really it depends. It depends on what type of investor, it depends on what type of project, is being looked at. In my world, a lot of the projects are really private sector investments into specific projects. And very often debt distress and debt sustainability doesn't play a huge part in the decision making for these. And I would say that there are a number of reasons why. Firstly, a lot of the countries that are in debt distress are not really the countries that people would be looking at anyway. There's a large overlap between the sort of less attractive, if you want to use that term, countries, and who the private sector is also looking to invest in. You know, I've seen projects happening. I mean, I was just talking to somebody who's doing a large mining project in Sierra Leone, and you know, they're seeing quite a lot of investment interest, just to throw something out of there. I think the picture gets a bit mixed when you start to look at sovereign type of issuances, people who are investing more in FPI type of investments and FDI investments, where obviously the ability of the sovereign to repay is much more important, and you don't want to get into debt distress. And we advised another African country, there have been quite a few of them in the summer just past, on raising a bond issue. And that was certainly a question that was asked, you know, often by potential investors. The bond issue was successful, but you know, this is another reason why you don't see a lot of African governments, or at least you see some African governments who aren't pushing for private sector participation in the SSI, because you know, they feel that they have really worked very hard over the last you know, what, decade, maybe even longer, to open up the markets to privates, to open up their markets, their Eurobonds and other lending to private sector investors. And they are afraid that if they do participate, and particularly if you know, that participation means that, you know, a default is formally called, then that will close the window to them being able to access the markets for periods that they don't know, and will definitely increase the prices that they're paying. And you know, as can be seen, many countries in Africa, those who do have access, have been able to access those markets more quickly, more easily, and I suspect with less complexity than they have been able to borrow from multilaterals and bilaterals. And thus, those markets are much more important to them than they were, again, maybe a decade ago. These are obviously for the sort of, you know, better off countries that do have access. The ones that don't have access, of course, this is all a kind of moot discussion. There is an interesting intersection, though, where questions of debt sustainability do start to impinge on even the FDI type of investors. And that is around particularly infrastructure projects, where they are financed ultimately with some sort of government guarantees behind them. These may be guarantees backing up the off-taker of a power project, which would often be a state-owned power company. Sadly, most state-owned power companies in Africa are insolvent, so they need some sort of government backup. Or other types of infrastructure projects where maybe some aspect of it is being guaranteed by the state, perhaps the volumes of usage or some other aspects. And then people who are looking to lend to these projects start to wonder, okay, if there is a default, if there is a restructuring, we are obviously way down in the pecking order, where we're unsecured guarantee of the government. What are the chances of us being paid out? Now, often some of those concerns, some of those risks can be structured out of projects, for example, by using meager guarantees, although in a general restructuring, even the meager guarantee kind of falls into the pocket, but at least that gives some investors some comfort. Having said this, and just to close on that point, I think that what I've seen in terms of investment is that it actually really hasn't fallen that much since the pandemic. Now, I have a theory around this, which is to say, it's not that people aren't concerned or there isn't really much of an impact. I think it's more a question around momentum. So if you think about the cartoons, I used to watch as a kid, where the coyote runs off the cliff and keeps on running for 10 meters or so before looking down, stopping and falling. I think to some extent, some of that is going on, in the sense that people have been developing projects. Often these projects take 10 years to develop. Those people who have been developing the projects are in the market for a long time, and are kind of used to the risks and the volatility. And hence, they continue with the projects. A lot of financing in our markets is still coming from DFIs who, even have a remit to increase what they're doing during the pandemic rather than reduce it. And so, that has all continued. So it would be interesting to see what happens a little bit when some of that built up momentum actually sort of plays out, and new projects that would have been sort of started in the last year or two are the ones that should be taking up the slack. I just wonder if we won't see some falling off as we go ahead. So yeah, sorry, there was a second question. I don't know if I've answered that as well. Nancy,
in broad terms you have, but the question was really, are things going to get worse in the sense of you're going to have more capital flow volatility with rising interest rates, and therefore some capital shifts away from.
Yes.
Are you saying your clients are worried about that?
Certainly, yes. And particularly, as I mentioned, I don't have a number in terms of the billions that were raised, but certainly I think 5 or 6 African sovereigns went to the Eurobond market over the summer. A couple actually have gone, 2, maybe even 3 times this year. You're also seeing that in the private sector. those financial institutions in particular who are able to access the Eurobond market. So you're seeing people sort of, I would say, fast forwarding their issuances to try and get into the market before interest rates might start ticking up. You see this in particular in bond issuances, and these are, by the way, both Eurobonds, but actually also in the domestic markets, because again, domestic markets do tend to track what happens internationally, even if there are a lot of local factors that play into it. So yeah, you're seeing quite a few bond issuances. It's less obvious in the other sectors and other types of financing, because these are not things that are easily switched on or off. If you are developing a power project, you know, you get to a point where it becomes bankable, and you know that isn't really in your hands. And once it becomes bankable, then you start looking for the funding, regardless of what the market conditions are, and you kind of hope that you're able to get funds at sort of prices that still work for the project. A lot of those other investments are also variable rate, so you're not so concerned about locking in a rate for the duration, because if you know the interest environment subsequently improves and rates come down, then your cost will go down as well. So we have seen some acceleration in Eurobond issuances as a result of this. I think you know people are concerned about you know when the taps may be switched off, or at least when the faucets may start to be tightened, if not completely switched off, and what that may mean for financing. But there's little that people who are developing the big kind of physical investments can do really to improve the timing. And then the final point is really just one that I made before, which is that at least in sectors which they are interested in, so this would include, for example, things like climate change, you know, the DFIs who are disproportionately large providers of long-term project financing in the African markets would continue at least to provide the liquidity, albeit at you know higher prices if global interest rates have gone up. So I would say it's a mixed picture. People are concerned about it. It is affecting behavior to some extent, but it's also there are also limitations on what people can really do to hedge against it.
Okay, very helpful answer. So I want to turn to questions from the audience. We have gotten some questions coming in, so I want to pose those now. We've got a little time left. So first of all, the first one has to do with these transparency issues that we've been discussing. And the question of disclosure in particular by official creditors. As Anna mentioned in the beginning, we don't really even have official creditors uniformly and consistently disclosing the terms and conditions of their credits. So the question is, and I guess I would pose this to both Anna and to Greer, because as she described, IIF has been involved in this transparency challenge. First of all, do we know which official creditors, at least bilateral official creditors, do actually consistently disclose? And second, where should the disclosed data sit? Who should hold it? Where should the database be? And this gets into the question of whether the IMF and the World Bank, as proposed in the report, should be the repository, or whether the OECD should be involved. So I'd love to hear from both Anna and Greer on this question. So Anna first.
This is a great question, and honestly, I don't really know, right? What about who consistently, the full set of people who consistently disclose. I stumbled on, GICA because of a Chinese lending project that we were doing. And all I can tell you is that most do not. The vast majority don't, right? And this is in contrast to the multilaterals. And what I want to flag is, again, even if all that was disclosed, even if all that were disclosed would be the general terms and conditions, right? That would be massively helpful, because then you see if you're departing from the standard form or if you're adding to it, the debtors, which already have limited capacity, know to focus on that and can get advice on that, right? So I think that's vital, and basically nobody does it. And where should it be? Look, I do think it would be awfully nice to have it at the fund or the bank. I think the critical point, and this is where I think I'm also uneasy about, what's going on with the IIF and OECD. It's a step in the right direction, but at the moment we're at risk of proliferating databases and then extra work needing to be done on making them comparable, intelligible, accessible, really to the public, right? And the sooner we can have the database to end all databases, frankly, the better. And the presumption has got to be complete disclosure. We can talk about exceptions when we get to it. And let's all look in the mirror, I guess, is the thing. Everybody, disclosure seems to mean I want to know what the other guy's doing. That's sort of what my conversations have been like. And, yeah, China, yeah, bondholders, yeah, official sector, we all want to know what the others are doing, but,
Yeah, and it's another collective action and prime mover problem. Who goes first? And it seems to me if big creditor governments can't go first, then it's going to be hard to expect others to. But Greer, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, excellent point by Anna. When the IIF was first conceptualizing of these voluntary principles for debt transparency, and then trying to figure out where to house it, there were lots and lots of conversations about that, and we had what we were kind of calling a quartet. So we were talking to the IMF and to the World Bank and to the Paris Club, and some to BIS and the OECD. I guess I just went beyond my quartet. My geometry teacher wouldn't be very happy, but we had lots of conversations about who could host this repository. And in the end, the OECD stepped up and said that they were happy to work with us. That certainly does not mean that we haven't also been working with the IMF and World Bank and Paris Club in terms of what will make sense in terms of a repository and what sorts of information needs to be gathered. Can we come up with a template to make it simple and easy so that you can kind of compare apples to apples? And, I think that at the end of the day, the point is also really important, that it needs to be something that people can access, that everyone can have access to. At the very beginning of this journey, there was talks about, maybe using some sort of private, third-party platform, think your Bloombergs, your Dealogics. That's cost prohibitive. That's not going to work. So, I agree that, a proliferation of databases is certainly not good. But, I think we're in a positive position, and we have a lot of positive momentum. And, we've gotten support, obviously, not just from the OECD, IMF, World Bank, et cetera. But, the UK government has contributed to help us start to conduct pilot projects so that we can actually see what happens when information and data is provided to this repository. And a lot of the IIF member firms have also made generous contributions. So I think, to put a finer point on it, everyone realizes this is important, and just having a repository or a database for the sake of having it is not the answer. But, it's taking time, and hopefully, it will be time well spent once, this is up and operational.
Yeah, thanks. And this is obviously a place where the shareholders of the multilateral institutions have to speak very clearly in terms of their expectations for what the institutions should take on, because I think the institutions themselves are reluctant to take on the responsibility of being the definitive source of data and risking situations where their data is inaccurate. So another question has to do, going back to Elena's point before about whether restructurings are sufficient and whether they actually do achieve debt sustainability. And we've seen from the IMF itself in its reports a kind of frank admission that they've, in many cases, been overly optimistic about their debt sustainability analysis. So I wanted to direct this both to Elena and to Andrew as an investor. Do you feel that, or how should this question be addressed? And do you, at a rating agency and as an investor, have confidence in the debt sustainability analyses of the IMF and the World Bank as a basis for debt restructuring, with the implication in many cases that the restructurings are going to have to be very deep and the haircuts are going to be very significant? But do you have confidence in those analyses?
I might have the easier one here. I'll start. We do our own credit analysis. So we have our own methodologies which are published and transparent on how we assess sovereigns. And we do kind of our own credit analysis of what we think creditworthiness will look after a debt restructuring.
Do you find that yours differ frequently from those of the IMF?
It's different because the exercise is different, so they're not directly comparable. Yeah.
So, and Andrew, is this something that you and your clients look at very closely, the debt sustainability analyses of the IMF and their implications for debt restructuring terms?
Yeah, luckily, there haven't been too many recently. I guess we're all, all eyes are on Zambia and what, where that ends up. But I think to generalize the response, most sophisticated investors will look at different sources and also try to come to their own conclusions with a healthy dose of skepticism applied to those sources. And to some extent, this goes back to a point that has been made often in this conversation, which is around debt transparency. It's very difficult for a private investor to really get details of what's going on in a country on their own. And so to some extent, they have to rely on bodies like the IMF or like credit rating agencies, because they have access to that data and can compile it. So I mean, for example, a lot of people have been looking at the IMF, particularly last year, of course, when everyone was very concerned. People were looking a lot at the IMF index, distressed debt index, and which countries were on it, etc. But this didn't really, this wasn't the sort of dispositive thing in making or not making an investment. I mean, it was one of the data points that people would look at. And again, if I go back to what I was saying, if you look at most countries, they've been able to raise funding. They've been able to raise more funding than has been raised from official sources. So that hasn't, and I think there are two distinct things. So there's one is what numbers and what are you looking at that tells you about the probability of debt distress, or at least the probability of debt distress becoming something worse than just distress? And then if there's a restructuring, how do you rate or how do you rank what's coming out of the restructuring and what have you? As I said, for the second question, there are not really a lot of data points in Africa that one can look at recently. So it's not really a question that's being studied. I think the first one is, okay, if I invest in this country, am I likely to run into a debt restructuring? That is something that people have been paying a lot of attention to. And as I say, they look at the credit ratings, they look at what the IMF is saying, and then try and draw their own conclusion from that.
Thanks.
If I get one last point on this, I think, looking at this, just recognize there's a lot of uncertainty in what the world's going to look like in the few years after debt restructuring, both in the economics, in government policy, and what fiscal outcomes are. Just recognizing, I think, that uncertainty and moving to kind of more of scenario analysis in terms of there are a variety of outcomes that the world can end up in. And I think we've moved that direction. I think the IMF is moving in that direction. So I think that's important to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it'll really be very interesting to see, and this is picking up on something Andrew said, whether this market access that he was referring to through this very difficult period will be sustained going forward in 2022, when you have these big changes in monetary conditions and potentially in capital flows, because that will really be a structural shift. If countries, even countries that are under some debt distress, maintain market access through these very difficult external financial conditions, and therefore are looking at private markets as in some cases, more desirable source of funding than the multilateral development banks or the international financial institutions. That's a big change. So that's something we really should look at. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I wanted to give each of our panelists and also Yanis an opportunity to do a 1-minute reaction to anything they want to react to in this conversation before we close. And I'd like to start with Eric.
Thank you, Nancy. It was so good to be with all of you today. And again, congratulations on the very fine report. One comment I would like to make is, I found what Andrew just shared to be very important and quite striking. And it's something I don't think we look at enough. And that's, acknowledging how important private investment is for countries. These public databases are really going to help private investors. We have seen, unfortunately, the failure in both IMF reporting as well as the credit agencies, which have been a really, really challenging nut to crack. So having a little bit more information could also spur the right kind of investment and the right kinds of contracts that countries need. So I just want to highlight that. And of course, just to launch off this report, I think this is very helpful to start, a further and deeper conversation on questions around debt restructuring, which transparency is going to help. But I think there are still some vital questions that I think we can find some consensus to that are still on the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Absolutely clear. Comparable treatment will be one of the vital questions. Anna.
So first of all, thank you again and congratulations again. And I think we can say that many, many times. And second, I really want to push us all to be way more disciplined about terms like market access and sustainability and comparability, right? Because even in the course of this conversation, it kind of turns out that market access in general is very different from market access in particular, right? And then, would that our buy-side friends would tell the borrowing countries what Elena just said, and that is, your reputation will suffer if you don't restructure enough, not if you stop paying in the middle of the pandemic, right? The point is for us to get to the same page on, what is sustainable, and sustainable in a big way, right? And this, gets to your point about new investment. This is about, basic human needs and human flourishing and people being healthy and resilient in the face of climate shocks, right? This is serious stuff, and we need to really get past kind of giving ourselves the opportunity to demagogue this stuff and to a serious discussion about, you know, loss allocation, division of responsibility, and you know, looking in the mirror and trying to make the world a better place, starting right here. Thank you.
Thanks for that needed perspective, Anna. Andrew.
Thank you. And again, it's been a pleasure to be on this panel. And again, I don't think you can be congratulated too much on your report. So let me congratulate you once more. I think there are 2 points. The first point is that a lot of these conversations, and I can understand why, do you know, happen at the level of you know, sovereigns, as in, you know, the sovereign lenders, as in the IFIs, and you know, the private sector. Although, you know, there's some sort of token, if I can use that word, effort to bring them along. It's more kind of inviting them into something that's already been structured, rather than, you know, them really being part of the dialogue. And I think that the way funding is happening is changing, and the private sector is becoming much more important. And this is why you're seeing a number of, you know, African countries either, definitely, you know, some turning down the whole DESI thing in total, because they're just concerned that it may block access, and certainly not pushing, even those that are joining up, certainly not pushing the private sector participation part of it. The flip side is, of course, you know, if a government doesn't need to restructure, all the debt needs to be restructured to get it to you know, something that's sustainable. And obviously the best thing is not to have to restructure in the first place. So for me, I think I would love to see much more private sector involvement, and I mean real involvement, rather than just sort of being consulted in some of these discussions. Because I think they're doing things that may shut off private sector flows, you know, after African countries have worked so hard to open that up. You know, would be very unfortunate. The flip side of this is that I think, you know, should a country, for whatever reason, be unfortunate enough to need a restructuring, and again, from the African perspective, it's important that that restructuring takes you to a point where you become sustainable, because neither the populations, nor the governments, nor the markets can you know, withstand constant restructurings, you know, like we saw sometimes during the Euro crisis a few years ago, where, you know, something is agreed and then all of a sudden, you know, it's dire for Greece all over again, and they have to go and renegotiate it. You can't do that with African countries, because they just don't have the resilience along many dimensions for that. Thank you. That was more than a minute.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, Elena Greer, and then Yanis, I'm going to give you the last word. If you could each do just 1 minute.
Thank you for having us today and for the opportunity to share our perspectives. We are happy to engage in further dialogue on any of these issues. You know, we really welcome the forward-looking nature of the report in terms of what happens after debt distress. And I think that's really important to move the conversation there. And my last 2 cents, you know, crises are a great time for innovation, and it's really nice to see some of that coming to the fore. So thank you.
Greer.
All right, I know we're very over, so I'll try to be super brief. Thank you again. I think that one of the testaments to being on a really good panel and hearing good presentations is the number of notes that you take when you're a panelist, and I've just taken so many. So thank you for giving me a chance to participate in this. And I won't repeat what others have said. The one thing that I will say that I don't think we were able to address just given time is that, you know, one of the things that the IIF is doing, as I mentioned, is kind of re-updating our principles for fair debt restructuring. And something that would be interesting to talk about further at some point is how we address exogenous events like pandemics, like climate change, through the use of state contingent debt instruments, and also how to integrate ESG and natural capital considerations in restructuring considerations and negotiations. Things like sustainability-linked bonds, I think, will be even more important as we move forward. So again, I think there's even more rich areas for discussion of how we can be forward-looking, as Ellen has said, and again, testament to the forward-looking nature of the report. So thank you.
Thanks, Greer. Good suggestions. Final word to you, Yanis.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all. My final word is this, that indeed, what is special about this crisis, or what we believe all the impending crisis, both of the debt, but also climate and sustainability, is that they are not isolated. When we have isolated crises, it is always easy to have fragmentation. It is always easy, the collective action problem is actually more acute. But when we all face the same problem, it is evident to everyone that they have to work together. And I think this comes out from many of the recommendations that we have been making. That's actually the point that I've tried to make at the very end of my presentation, that to me, this is a discussion that moves beyond the usual debates between statute and contract. It is actually, what are the tools we all need to sort out the mess we probably face, and which be collective mess, and also the future, which is, again, is not an individual country's future, it's everybody's future. And that resolves collective action issues, because effectively it forces everybody to act as one. And I think if we have helped with the debate of that, I'd be very happy. So thank you again for asking me to participate both in the roundtable and in this.
Thank you, Yanis, and I think that's an excellent place to end the conversation. These efforts to thread through these challenges and identify solutions are in everyone's interests, both creditors and debtors, both public and private. So I think the report does contribute some specific and useful recommendations to be discussed further, but I like some of the suggestions for additional work that Greer and others put forward. So I suspect you will be hearing some more from CGD on this, and I want to thank FES and CBI for helping us with both this event and the report once again. Thanks everyone for participating.